Here we go. So welcome everyone. This is a workshop in our Information Literacy Workshop series. This is one on evaluating sources. My name is Tom Bickley. I'm the library faculty member who's the subject specialist for performing and visual arts, philosophy, political science, and international studies. And it's a real pleasure to be with you today. We have slides and an example to look at and a chance to really explore the concepts of evaluating sources. So let me move to the next slide here. Probably the main question I would pose for us all is an information source appropriate in the context that you need to use it for? Then this applies to all aspects of information use in life. So I'm really advocating abandoning the notion of an information source being good or bad, and rather asking, does it fit what you need now? So you'll always want to consider the context in which you're working. Is it what to have for dinner? Is it where to park, where to look for a parking place, I should say, on our campus? Is it what book to read? Is it what article to choose for a term paper? Is it what bibliographic style to use when you're citing a source? Those kinds of things. And there are different standards for measuring quality of information, so that does come down to the appropriateness of something. Is it the right level of quality that you need? So I want to use a set of lenses, I'd call them, which we call the information literacy framework, to consider these questions. The framework are 6 ways of thinking about information. And the reason you can think of it as a frame, I've come to think of it as a lens through which I'm examining sources. It actually emerged from some work done several years ago by former library faculty members here at CSU East Bay, Lori Townsend, Corey Brunetti, and Amy Hoffer. Their website is ilthresholdconcepts.com. And there's also a lot more information about this framework on the Association of College and Research Libraries site. And I'm glad to make these slides available to you so you can follow those again. What are the frames in this framework? There's 6 of them. They're not in a hierarchical order, and we use them in different ways. They are: authority is constructed and contextual, information creation as a process, information has value, research as inquiry, scholarship as conversation, and searching as strategic exploration. So I want to use these frames today to examine a particular scholarly journal article, that is, titled Listening to Deep Listening, Reflection on the 1988 Recording and the Life Work of Pauline Oliveros, written by Sharon Stewart. There you see the MLA citation for this. And I'm very happy to say that with us today is Sharon Stewart, coming to us from her studio in the Netherlands. She's kindly agreed to share her insights about the process of creating this article. Before we actually do more of an introduction for Sharon, I want to take a look with you at this article. This is on the Journal of Sonic Studies, and the layout is a little curious thanks to this research catalog site. But as you see, it is a rich article, not only in terms of amount of text and marvelous vocabulary, but there's samples in here as well. You can hear samples of the recording that she's mentioning. It should be audible to you in the background there. And there's also video clips. Here's what our mentor, Pauline Oliveros, looks like in her teaching. Let me play that for you a little bit. Let the credits roll. And here's Pauline.
So-called master class. And of course, what I'm wanting to offer today is I want to tell you a little bit about myself to start, and then ask everyone to.
So that actually, in that kernel, you have a sense of Pauline's personality. So this article has a lot of wonderful footnotes, which is one of my preferences in terms of format as opposed to endnotes, and is organized well with illustrations appropriate as well as the rich media. And of course, as we'd expect to find, at the end is a reference list, all of which are referred to throughout the article in the various notes. So let's go back to the slides, and actually let me stop sharing and introduce you to Sharon in the video feed here. Did that succeed in stopping? I think it did.
Yes.
Yes, good. So Sharon, welcome. Tell us, where are you? Oh, are you muted? Let me unmute you. Sorry.
Yay, there we go.
Thank you.
Yes, good. No, it's good that if you're can be quiet in the back room there. I'm in Arnhem in the Netherlands right now. Was the question? Sorry,
Yes, that was the
yeah, that
where
was
where are you?
where I was unmuting
It's
myself.
the
Yes.
question.
Yeah. So that's Arnhem's on the east side, about 20 kilometers from the German border. But if you get on a train, you can be in Amsterdam on the west side in about an hour and 15 minutes. So direct.
Good. So we appreciate your presence today. When I was thinking about what article to look at and found yours, I thought, well, this is a really good chance to see if you were available to talk with us today. And so as we go through this, I probably depending on how many screens any of you who are watching are using, you'll be able to see both of us. But I'll go back to sharing the screen because I want to move into some of the questions that we have for this. Let me navigate back to that. Sharon and I have been friends and colleagues for a number of years and teaching together in some of the coursework for the Deep Listening program through Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
I think we met each other in 2014 in Rensselaer.
I think that's
That was
right.
when we first met each other live. I was on also the Deep Listening group on Google, and so I think we had some interaction there probably as far back as 2008.
It could well be, exactly. So a significant amount of time, and I really appreciate your presence. So
Thank you.
as we think about the first of the frames on the list, it's not the first frame hierarchically. Authority is constructed and contextual. So this really comes to the core of the fact that we recognize knowledge authority depending on the context that we're in. What happened to the neighbor next door is probably the best source is somebody in her household. What happened
Right.
in the news would be another source, and so forth. So in academic practice, we certainly, for understandable reasons, privilege higher degrees and the North Atlantic intellectual tradition, but we also are aware that there are other lineages of transmission of knowledge, and so we don't want to miss those. One of the reasons I chose the article that you wrote, Sharon, is that it draws on a number of sources of information. It's not only strictly academic sources, but provides a meaningful weaving together of these sources. So one question I always ask about a source is who wrote this? And so to ask you, what do you understand as your qualifications in the context for writing this article?
Right. I wrote it, at least I think I did, but of course authors draw upon all kinds of rich resources and other people thinking with them. So I think the context, which is a bit interesting and should be explained right up front, is the Journal of Sonic Studies was begun in 2011. And I was actually the associate editor of the Journal of Sonic Studies all from the beginning, which meant that I was working with English editing for all the articles that came through. So the second issue that was coming out was regarding listening. And the editors knew that I had been involved with deep listening, and they were very eager to have an article by Pauline Oliveros in this issue. And so I reached out to Pauline Oliveros, and she didn't have time at that moment. And I reached out to several other people, also kind of, let's say, senior members of the deep listening community. And in the end, because because deep listening is not only an academic or a specifically textual knowledge-based source, but is actually a practice, it seemed very important not to rely only on someone who had researched who is Pauline Oliveros or researched what is deep listening, but someone who had a fairly intimate knowledge of the practice. And because I had been at 3 deep listening retreats between 2008, 9, and 10, had become very involved in the practice, and had also become certified in deep listening, then then I felt like I could be someone who could then write this from the perspective of doing deep listening, not just what is it on a kind of a rational or cognitive level. And the other very important aspect of deep listening is that, and was important for Pauline Oliveros, was that it's a community. So it was also important for someone, also for Pauline Oliveros, someone who was also involved with discussing and dialogue within the community of deep listeners. And as I kind of fulfilled these kind of ticking off the boxes that I was involved with the practice of deep listening, I also was interested in researching it. Also, of course, the many articles written by Pauline Oliveros, but also Martha Mockas's book, for example, that's more of a biography from a certain perspective. Then I got the wonderful privilege of being able to write this article, also with kind of the blessing of Pauline Oliveros and Ione and Eloise, and contributed to the Journal of Sonic Studies.
So one of the benefits, I would say, is that this is a building of that intellectual tradition, and that you were really, I would say, ideally placed to handle this. That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you. So qualifications come in more than one way. I think that's also an important element in this.
Right, and it was both the aspect that I was also kind of intimately aware of the audience for the Journal of Sonic Studies at that point, which it was just a beginning journal, but already in this issue on listening, there were people like Murray Schafer submitted his keynote address, Ruth Herbert, who's written lovely books on listening, and Salome Vögelen, who is very well known in European circles with her writings, also on listening and ethics, were part of this. And so it seemed to me vital to have the work of Pauline Oliveros with her deep listening as one of really seminal practices. Investigating listening.
I think you might be answering questions down the road, but this is good.
Yes.
Thank you. So, the next frame of information creation as a process. So, obviously, creating anything it takes some process involved, even if we're not cognizant of it, or it's below or above or sideways of our consciousness. But in this case, I'm curious about your memories, and realizing it's been a while since you wrote the article, of your process of ideation, of drafting, of submitting the peer review matter, and of editing your article, because these can all be interesting challenges. And I'd like for anyone watching this to be aware that these are not just a cut and dried, one-size-fits-all process, but that it will vary. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, and once again, it was kind of a unique situation, the fact that I was within the, editing body of the journal to which I also submitted. So that gives sometimes a bit tricky situation, because you have kind of a privileged position, but you also need to produce something of quality. For me, I think if I think about the original idea, because her work is so process-based, I really needed to have also a framework to being able to say something textually about it. And the framework that I received was indeed this kind of Cohen-like writing in her book, The Roots of the Moment. And if you look, I don't know if you can open back up the journal, the RC. Is that easy to do, or is that?
Yes, no, I think that should be. Let me go back
if you look at
to the
top,
journal article itself.
These sections are based on the 4 lines of this poem. So I could love my listening, I could listen to me listening, I could perform my listening, and I could be my listening. And so while this was very poetic, and also very text that kind of triggers thought, it also actually formed a very, so there, yes, you can see I could love, my listening is at the top of the first, the column, yeah. And then if you, but if you keep going, actually bringing the top available. So going in the other direction, if you see the headings there, I could love my listening. I could listen. That was the, in this way, the way of organizing these various aspects of this practice of deep listening. As far as I submitted my article, it was already in a fairly complete form, and that had to do with the fact that it needed to be written pretty quickly. So if I remember correctly, it was published in May, that part I remember, and I think that probably around the beginning of April, mid-April even, that I kind of submitted it almost as a complete article, and I received very good feedback, and that was also because I deal with concepts of perception, which if you're not a neuroscientist, you have to be very careful with what you can say about that. And also for a particular audience, there were some questions like, okay, can you really say this? Do you have the kind of knowledge to be able to say certain things? Or maybe I was constructing things in a bit too complicated way. So I chopped some things out that I thought, I don't think that's probably, it's maybe a good idea, but I would need to research it another 3 years to say something worthwhile about it. And the other very good point was they wanted more audio visual, because the idea was that this journal is an open access online journal about sound. So we want sound, we want also sound and image, and that to be able to be embedded. To be honest, when this first was published, it was actually with an online publisher coming from the University of Leiden. But then the research catalog came along later, and it was a more flexible, easy for also authors to upload articles themselves. So we did a switch over a few years ago. And so my article was in a bit more, in the original version, a bit more maybe polished, like and now it has a little bit of more of a do-it-yourself kind of aesthetic, which is also fun. But with all of the articles, the important thing was to include as much, and that's when I found this beautiful masterclass given by Pauline at Sonic Axe, in which she discusses herself a number of the aspects of deep listening. So this was then a fabulous reiteration or way of representing the material, also with including this Pauline's voice herself, so Oliveros herself.
It makes for a very rich document, in fact, multi-level that way.
And also the sound at the beginning, but that's also going into a later question, I believe, is something that was really important to me as being the sound of the excerpt from King Lear from this Deep Listening CD was really the basis of a kind of thinking and a kind of expressing something through sonic thought that runs parallel to the more verbal or textual linguistic thought of the text part of this, this article.
Multiple streams of knowledge, which two things occur to me. One is to mention that the entire CD is available, licensed from New Albion on through Orchard Music Distributors on YouTube. So anyone who'd like to listen to the whole thing can simply search on YouTube for Deep Listening, and it has the full album there now.
Highly recommend.
That hasn't been there forever, I think, but it is quite wonderful. Well, on to the next, in fact.
And that's maybe important to mention that I did need to get permissions, of course. So that was really key right at the beginning to get all the permissions so that I wouldn't be left kind of hanging and not being able to include something that was crucial. Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's relevant also to the information has value frame. But,
yes.
And two of the prompts that strike me, you've partially responded to this in a sense, just it's impossible not to, but this also shows that these really weave together beautifully. So what strikes you as the value of information in this article? And do you feel like that's the same as the fact that the article is published and distributed?
Right. For me, when I think of, and this is an interesting, I don't know if I fully indeed had wrapped my brain about what I hadn't really thought about it in terms of value before, but I knew that my audience was a group of sound artists, writers on sound, field recordists, composers, and it felt for me that the value was to be able, it was to offer them a kind of an opening into the world of deep listening, also in a way that was somewhat akin to the doing of this deep listening, so that they could kind of experience it themselves. And that value, I think, came from the fact that I think that Pauline Oliveros had a unique voice, of course, within the whole, not only electronic music, but in the way of, in a way similar to Cage, of releasing the potentiality of sound and of listening and of the community aspects of music making on a really, really fundamental level. And so the value I saw was in really giving this kind of body of knowledge producers, whether it's through music or through writing about music, kind of access to her work. And I wanted to do that in as really as a careful and caring way possible. I don't know if we run statistics, but if you look at our SoundCloud, this recording of King Lear has been listened to multiple thousands of times. Mm-hmm. And the Vimeo is just uploaded on my Vimeo site, which has very few viewers, but I think one has gotten over 5,000 or even 10,000 views. So in that sense, I was also pleasantly surprised that while it's kind of a really niche audience, it seems to have also somehow blossomed in other spaces that we maybe weren't expecting. So yes, that's about what I have to say about value.
No, that's fine. Well, those are interesting metrics also in terms of impact, because we do often see journals that are reporting the number of references to a given article, for example. But this is another media-focused way, I guess I'd say, of doing that. So, yes, that makes sense.
And I think, you have academia.edu and ResearchGate.
Right.
So I have some kind of lens into also who is citing this. I think if Kannenberg was, that would be a wonderful
in fact, Google Scholar will offer that as well. So.
Oh, okay. See, there we go.
And welcome to folks who just joined in too. So another frame of this is research as inquiry. And the little gloss from the ACRL is that research is iterative, that is, it repeats and depends upon asking increasingly complex or new questions whose answers in turn develop additional questions. I've always guided my students to say that you start out with a topic, a question emerges, and that question transforms as you go, almost always. So I'm curious about I think one answer is that lovely poem from Pauline at the beginning of the article, but what questions or puzzles or concepts or insights were driving your research process while you worked on this article? What can you remember from that time?
Fabulous. I really enjoyed going back and thinking about this. Also, it was 8 years ago. And I'm going to grab a few books here because these are the people who thought with me. This book by Marcel Kogerson, Thresholds, Rethinking Spirituality Through Music, really opened up a very central question, and that is also for practice-based research. What knowledge can we transmit through sound, through music, that we cannot transmit in any other way? So it's about the special characteristics. What is it about sound that can transmit knowledge, tacit knowledge? You come into terms like qualia, perception. So this was, with this article, I remember being so struck by this particular performance with the Deep Listening Band with Pauline Oliveros, Stuart Dempster, and Panayotos. I always have to look up.
I've always wondered, yes.
how to pronounce his name. It's a Greek name. So I was hearing something, and I wanted to be able to say, what, if I'm thinking through music, what are the things that this music is saying to me outside of language, and what am I hearing? And I tried to work that out in this article. What then also came up then was, of course, what is perception? And I think I was a bit naive in the beginning because I started thinking, well, there's probably, you know, a common definition of perception. And if I, you know, read a few articles, then I will understand what perception is. But it pretty soon became clear to me that this is actually a question that, you know, maybe even the top neuroscientists are still working on, because it has a lot to do with consciousness and with the way the mind works. And that we are also thinking about the mind, the way the mind registers things. So in trying to approach this question, I'm not in any way a neuroscientist. I mean, I have my master's in music pedagogy from the Royal Conservatory in The Hague. So I knew I also needed to find something that also connected to the work of Pauline Oliveros, which is also based in Buddhist traditions, and so certain understandings of the self, also, yeah, of the mind, and also, you could say, also non-duality. So the wonderful books that I then got was Zen and the Brain by James Austin, and so started looking into things like attention, what is attention, also how the brain makes decisions before we actually realize it does, and also, let me see, what is the certain ways of processing information that are also spoken about or dealt with the musical relations practiced by Pauline Oliveros. So that was one book that helped me to talk a little bit more succinctly about attention and what that means, also how our brain filters. And the other one was called The Mind in the Brain by Schwartz and Bickley. That's a book from 2002. And there was just also one beautiful anecdote. It was talking about if a colorblind neuroscientist looked at like an MRI scan and knew exactly which neurons were firing in someone who saw the color red, would that be the same as her perceiving the color red? And of course, we realized that we're always then, it's a translation whenever you're working with one mode of doing or being or knowledge production, such as making music together, and then trying to translate that that process into words or verbalize it. So those were two sources, and I think that's so yeah, perception and the way, yeah, thinking through sound. Those were two of the yeah, puzzles or concepts that are still fascinating me also.
That makes sense. So a number of driving forces that led to the creation of this, or to there's also a process, I think, for any of us who research and write and teach, and I would advocate that this is the case too when you enroll in a class and you suddenly discover, oh, there's a term paper I need to write. How do you discern what you're going to write about? What are the driving forces? And ideally, it can be something that catches your imagination and has some emphasis for you of enjoyment and pleasure in there. So yeah, thank you.
Right, yes. And I think also because I'm also a music educator, it also had me listening a lot to when a student who performs a certain piece for me, what am I also hearing in that music that tells me something about their physical state, something about their mental state, something about their very being that I'm hearing, but how am I hearing that? So it's a lot of tacit knowledge that I was trying to kind of unfold and figure out, what is it that I'm hearing? Are there also kind of dimensions or empirical dimensions, something that I can actually kind of measure and see? And yeah, there's also the also more spiritual ideas, such as the no brain, or emptying the brain and see if you can still make decisions, because these are also kind of paradoxes that are explored in Pauline Oliveros's works. How do you make decisions as you are improvising? And can you make a decision if you suspend any decision making, but you're also aware that you're suspending your decision making? So all these layers of kind of meta awareness and meta listening were fascinating. to
I
me.
think that makes sense. I think that it really is a reminder that research as inquiry comes right weaves together with the searching as a strategic process, which we'll get to soon. But so going on to the scholarship as conversation, since this is something that probably makes more sense to those of us who've lived an academic life more than maybe somebody just coming into it, certainly, say, a first-year student, although some are familiar with this. We form knowledge in conversation, in community, and in the academic world, we certainly do have an ongoing conversation and sometimes misunderstandings and sometimes enriched understandings. So I was interested in your sense of how you've experienced your work on this article, as I worded it here, as your scholarly endeavor as conversation with others in this broad community.
I think it's beautiful that you start with students, because it's true that I remember my perception as a student was that I was reading books by all these people who I didn't know. And then if you stay within academia long enough, you're basically reading books by everyone you know, or someone
True.
who's only 2 degrees away. So you're reading books by your friends or acquaintances or people you've met at a seminar, and you can talk about their book with them and how it affected you. And that's a beautiful part about spending a few decades within the world of academia, that you start knowing the people behind the books. Yes, so of course I had this dialogue with Pauline Oliveros herself. So I could also ask her if she would that's a very important part of the whole kind of iteration and also peer review is, of course,
Absolutely.
Pauline Oliveros, Eloise Gold, and Ione all had my article before it was published and were free to give their responses to it and add or make small adjustments in what was said. So, so I had this kind of conversation also with Pauline Oliveros, and I was asking her, if what she thought of what I wrote, and she was very, very positive. So that was beautiful. Actually, I don't really think she had any. No, she had no major problems with it or things that even needed to be adjusted. As I said, and I used a lot of the source texts were from Pauline Oliveros herself, but I didn't want it to become kind of this closed bubble of knowledge. So that was also why the book by Martha Mockers, Pauline Oliveros and Lesbian Musicality, Sounding Out.
Which is available in our library collection also. So someday it will be again. We have the
Fabulous.
physical copy, yeah.
Such a very caring kind of, it's kind of it's more of a biography of her work, I find, than really a biography of Oliveros herself in a way, because it's specifically tied to lesbian musicality, as she says. And so I also reached out to Dr. Marcus online, and we had a nice kind of lively email exchange. There were also the certificate holders, people who were into deep listening. I sent out a request, hey, I was so inspired by a certain article, here's another, The Other Side of Nowhere, in which Oliveros has this harmonic anatomy, women in improvisation. And so she and then she lists a number of women towards the end who she really admires, and she gives kind of juicy tidbits about the way they improvise. And it's really written in such a way that builds community and with such a deep respect for her fellow female improvisers in this. I think, at this point, at that point, you weren't talking about whether people identified with a certain gender. It was just women that she was talking about. That's interesting. Yeah, women in improvisation. So using that as an example, I reached out to the deep listening community and says, hey, with that section from her poem, I could perform my listening. I really wanted people to give examples of themselves performing their listening. And so we have Jimena Alarcón and Kristen Noorderval. I think she was in Norway. Jimena was, I believe, in England at the moment, and Kristen was in Norway, and they provided me with lovely examples from their work with deep listening, as well as texts explaining it that was about I could perform my listening. And so that was, and I think the last level of conversation, talking about conversation, is I really wanted to have this kind of conversation with the reader themselves. I bring up that, I don't know if that was at the point when, because Pauline Oliveros, at some point she said, when people ask me, what is deep listening? I say, I don't know. And so I was really trying to give them the feeling that it is a practice, and I can't tell you what it is. Just take some of the things, you do it, and then you tell me what it is for you. Because in that sense, I don't think anyone can call themselves an expert on deep listening. And I really tried to state that in the beginning. It's not because Pauline did not like these hierarchical, I am a musician, I'm a composer, and you're not. Right. That was something she was working her whole life to break down and to invert or reconstruct, recompose in a lot of different performance settings. So I really want to say, hey, this is a shared body of knowledge. It's always changing. It was before it was named. It's going to be 10 years time different than it is now, but it's only through the people who are involved who give it its meaning, who construct what is deep listening. And I think, as the practice has become a little bit more canonized, that's also something that, it's still important. I think that it's a real conversation between also the person and the practice, and they can then tell you, what it is for them. And you don't have to tell them what it is. So, yeah, those were.
I find myself wondering if I think there are other fields in which we'd find parallels. I mean, certainly in other humanities areas such as say poetics and so forth, but in theology, no question about that. One of my other disciplines.
Oh yes. And within, like, if you talk about it reminded me a lot of more like healing traditions. So you have like yogic traditions where you have a teacher and then the body of knowledge, and then you have to decide who's able to pass on that knowledge, because it's actually coming more through transmission than through kind of erudite study or something. So yeah, and spiritual traditions, yes.
And I'd say it's worth giving an appreciative nod to our colleagues in the sciences to say that although it's a little bit different approach to formation of knowledge because of the scientific method and so forth, but there is a necessary community agreement to what meets standards of inquiry, and so knowledge is formed in community in the sciences as well. It's not, that doesn't mean to say that it's any less empirically tested in that realm, but there is an important community element in there, and peer review in the sciences is absolutely essential as well.
I think that's a really good point. And also that you know very quickly when you step outside the bounds of what you're able to say. I think within the humanities, as long as you stay within kind of a humble, say, I can say this to this point, and then people are like, okay, but once you kind of surpass certain bounds of what you're actually able to talk about, that's, I think, very quickly called out.
Exactly.
You hope. I mean, there have been some, of course, these moments when.
Well, that different things. Yeah. So conversations, as our colleague Lori from some years back would mention to her students, that conversations sometimes become lovers' spats and become arguments as well. So we prefer wiser discourse.
That can happen, yes.
Yeah. So the searching and strategic exploration, we've touched on almost every instance here, but one of the ways this articulates for me is, what were the information gathering strategies you employed as you worked on this article? You've mentioned contact with Pauline, email correspondence with Martha Marcus. Do you recall adjusting the strategies or how you were forming questions as you went and so forth? Just interested in your thoughts on that process as you worked through this article.
Right. This was also kind of I think I felt like I went through pretty standard procedures, like looking through all the works of Pauline Oliveira, or not all of them, but the ones that seemed relevant, what I had time for, figuring out who her resources were. I think if I were to do it again, I might even, at that point, I kind of based my listening on one recording because it gave it a nice focus. But I would, if I were to do it again, maybe listen to more or a variety of her recordings. But I don't know if that was within the scope of this article. I think also, yeah, I have kind of talked about how I tried to branch into like theories of cognition and perception with understanding the brain and the mind with these two books I mentioned earlier. I'm looking also, perhaps the most interesting one that I wasn't expecting was a foray into John Cage's work, and coming across they're on the level of their impact with among students and among colleagues at the time. There were a lot of similarities. Both were extremely loved teachers who had a very transformative effect on a lot of other musicians around them and sound composers and so forth. But then breaking through the surface, I noticed that how different their approaches were to things like the chance or aleatoric method. And I think that's when I got into, I have lots of footnotes, and I think I started writing this very huge footnote about the differences between Oliveira's work and Cage's work, how they approached studio. And so the decision making within Cage, even when he was relying on chance operations in order to produce something that was new every time or unpredictable, once you got beyond that bit of chance, you often had very set patterns of music. I mean, there are probably other examples that I don't, that were a lot more open. Thinking of Music for Cactus, I don't know what the score is there, but maybe that was more open. But he, then the chance was kind of that moment when the universe could kind of give you the inspiration, but then you had to perform a very specific task. Whereas with Pauline Oliveros, she worked, I think the decision making in her work, certainly with the Sonic Meditations, is how the different individuals who are working together make decisions as the piece moves along. And that shapes the piece, but it has a much more human decision-making element to it, with also I think you could call it a chaotic or unpredictable outcome, but that had much more to do with the way communities interacted. And I found that that caught my attention maybe, and took me kind of maybe a bit off subject in a way, but yeah, I think that was, let me see. But yeah, and strategy, I think what was for me the first time was indeed trying to figure out using the sound element, the sonic element of this recording as something that kept influencing the way I was thinking, and also using kind of phenomenological explanation of how that recording, what it was doing with me, what I call in the work somatic listening. So at what levels was I listening and losing myself within the listening? That nice. So I think that was also definitely a new strategy for me. So how was this piece also thinking me? Mm-hmm. How was the sound thinking itself through me? And what was it making me think or experience that I wouldn't have if I was just reading books or looking up information about Pauline Oliveros or her working methods. So that was a really, the thinking through that one work was a really important strategy. Also, yeah, in writing and trying to kind of chase these other concepts that I was talking about earlier, like perception, what is it, and yeah.
That makes a great deal of sense that you were, and the footnotes, to my eyes as I read it, and I will confess I'm partway through the article, but it's such a rich, marvelous experience. It also brings to mind in terms of evaluation of sources, and especially thinking of our students, and to assure any student out there that we're learners also with you, that I at one point in my life would regard, say, introductions and forewords and so forth in books or footnotes in articles. Oh man, there's more I have to go through. And I've come to the point, and maybe, who knows, all the factors in this, in which footnotes and endnotes, anyway, that style of making references, which of course then end up pointing you to the reference list at the end, as being like the author being sitting beside you as you read and saying, say, did you think about this also? You know, look, there's also this you ought to consider. I would have talked more about this, but you can read some more about it over here. So I feel like it's somebody really handing you more insight into both the content and the process of the article. And that's one of the hallmarks for me of scholarly writing when it's at its best, when it's really good, is that it does that invitation and inviting you into more learning as you go.
Thank you. I know that my last submission was a nightmare because I love footnotes too much, because this sort of paratextual kind of, the things around what this kind of linear thing you put yourself in of what you need to kind of organize what you want to say so that it's cohesive and it makes sense. But I love, paratext and these, everything outside of the text and everything kind of glued on, or these appendages. So my last, it was for the handbook, the Bloomsbury Handbook on Sound Art, which also included Pauline Oliveira's Goody Pal and Pussy Riot, but they really made me almost cut out all footnotes. So that was for me a real. I think I might have almost more footnotes than I have actual text in this feed.
There are different styles. I do commend this article to you all. We have, about 10 more minutes, and let me go back to the shared screen here, to sharing my screen rather, of the slides. And there's more possibility in a moment to ask some questions. So we've looked at this thing we call the Information Literacy Framework. And I put in a link here to a document for that I've created a template that you might want to use. Let me see if I can actually just paste this into, paste this into the comment, window, so that you can get to this. And of course, obviously, you can get this from the slides when we distribute them. So here is this document. There we go. I think that should be to everyone in the chat window. I thought about how do we apply these. They're not a cut and dried checklist, but I think they are useful for ways of looking at that. And what I did was create a Google document. This is a template that each of you have access to now. And for each of these 6 frames, I put in a suggestion about ways of thinking about how to use them when you're examining an article. We don't always have the privilege of interviewing an author when we're looking at that, but one concept that may be useful is to imagine interviewing the author. What would you want to ask them in terms of their writing process and their research process when you're reviewing something? I always advocate investigating credentials, and you can use Google or whatever search engine you prefer and search in first name, last name. For example, in quotation marks, puts the first name and last name in that order, the name of the institution if they're in part of a university or research center. And if it's a particularly common name, you may want to add a subject to make that clearer. In fact, I think that when I was searching for this article, Sharon, what I did was search in the abstracted music literature on deep listening Sharon Stewart, and so it popped right up. It worked very well. To know whether a journal is peer-reviewed, you can search for that information on the journal's website, and there's usually a segment on information for authors or how to submit and editorial guidelines that describes that. And if you need to use a scholarly source, make sure you're looking for references and endnotes and footnotes. Does it tell you where the information came from? Examine information about the publisher. An academic journal is often published by a university. That's a good sign. Same with books. And then including all the above, vocabulary and writing style is a clue also. and so does it. One of my students years ago said, I can tell it's an academic source because I don't understand the words, which really isn't quite the best way, but it's a sort of rule of thumb that's useful, a litmus test there. So explore and expand your knowledge with this, definitely. I noticed that in the Journal of Sonic Studies, it's a blind peer-reviewed process. And Sharon, would you just can you give us a 2-minute picture of what that what that process looks like from the editorial side? Oh, are you muted? Let me unmute you. Sorry. Now, no.
I might
There.
actually be doing that myself because I'm muting myself sometimes when you're talking. So
Okay.
maybe it was me. Yes. So the articles are received. They get sent out to either people on our board or people who have said they will review it. We have our, that's not published online, I think, but we have our peer review document asking a number of questions about its suitability for this journal, about its use of audio-visual, it's being kind of a multimedia as far as that can be in the digital world. And I think it gets sent out to at least 2 and hopefully 3 peer reviewers who then can say kind of A, B, C, D, A being yes, publish, B being okay, but change a few things, C being we only publish if you do major changes, and D being no, this will not is not suitable for publication.
Yeah, so it is a process, and that's a reminder. I have an article I'm supposed to be reviewing for Leonardo Music Journal, so I need to get that back to the editor. So.
Right, so they now have very handy systems of reminders, which it can be a huge process.
Yes,
huge.
Exactly, but
keep track of if it's
hopefully
not automated.
will work. Exactly right. So thinking about as we come to the conclusion of today's session, when you have questions and want to consult further with us, certainly you can chat with us online. There's a link from the library's website. There's a pop-up window in the catalog and in the databases. There's the Ask Us link, lets you book a consultation with a number of us on the library faculty. That's a Zoom meeting. You're all welcome, certainly, to stop by my office hours on Thursdays from 10 to noon via that Zoom link. And I don't know if anyone has questions in the last 5 minutes here. We're really grateful to you, Sharon, for your presence with us and comments, and for all of you who are listening as well. Does anyone have questions or comments to add for us? If questions do emerge further as you go, thank you certainly for your presence. Here is my email address, and I'm happy to hear from you and help respond to anything I can. Type that in here. So there is the library events calendar, which you can see, and we are delighted to have you join us for any of these. There you see the note from Gur, and so hope you all have a very good day. Stay healthy and well, and take advantage of our electronic presence. We're here to serve your learning and to learn with you. So thank you all
so much.
Sharon, it's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Yes.
Thank you for your writings and for your research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.